Good afternoon. My name is Bob Armstrong. I'm director of the MIT Energy Initiative, and it's a pleasure to have you here, and a particular pleasure to have Phil Sharp here to give this colloquium. Phil has been involved with us at MIT and the MIT Energy Initiative since the beginning of the Energy Initiative on our external advisory board. And he brings a lot of policy experience to the table, and I think we're going to take advantage of that this afternoon. He served as president of Resources for the Future, which is an independent, nonpartisan research institution devoted exclusively to policy research, analysis on energy, environment, and natural resource systems. He served as a member of Congress from Indiana from 1975 to 1995. Hard to do these days, I think. Congratulations, Phil. He was involved in a variety of landmark legislation in the energy area, the 1992 Energy Policy Act. Following his service in Congress, he joined the Harvard Kennedy School faculty. We forgive you for that. And he was there from 95 to 2002, where he was director of the Institute for Politics during part of that time. He has taught climate policy making at Columbia University and at Georgetown University. He serves as a senior advisor to Resources to the Future. Today he's been on the board of a number of companies and nonprofits. So with that, I'm going to stop there so I don't take up your time, given more of your accomplishments.
Thanks,
but thank you so much, Phil.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I'm delighted to be here, and as some of the older set here probably know, at least I've heard, that Bob was one of the young faculty members here at MIT who said, good Lord, we ought to try to deal with global problems and orient our research in that direction. And of course, that was in the last millennium. But Bob has been very much involved, obviously, in under the leadership of President Hockfield and Ernie as director. Bob's been with this organization, MIT, from the beginning. My first exposure was, of course, through John Deutsch, because I had known John in Washington, where he was well known as one of the smartest people, and not necessarily always the easiest to agree with person in Washington. And I got that exposure, and then he asked me to head up one of the great studies that you folks do. I didn't contribute anything to it. I just presided over when the External Advisory Committee met. But one of the very important thing about those studies is, one, is they have been very significant in their impact in intellectual discussion and very much on the policy arena in this country. And what they did, of course, was to try to be multidisciplinary, try to bring together knowledge about technology, knowledge about the economy, knowledge about government policy, and then vet it. One of the reasons an external advisory committee existed was to vet it and try to see if what everybody from left, right, center, and all over the lot thought or had to add to that. Well, I'm delighted to be here, given the fact this university contributes so much to the very difficult challenge we're meeting in climate change, and beginning, of course, with trying to shrink the university's own carbon footprint, which is something that all institutions need to increasingly work on. But obviously, the university is also world-renowned for the fact that it's support for innovation, it's support for entrepreneurship. And this has been very important in the climate area. Right now, there's efforts to try to, in the marketplace, try to bring about photovoltaic coatings on windows so that we can get the light, but we can also get electricity out of that. We can get fluid batteries that might work at a grid scale level on the electric grid, meaning that it makes possible more intermittent kind of energy like solar or wind. And of course, there's always fusion, but finally we think fusion is actually on the verge of really doing something. And the spark reactor here and whatnot is a very important thing, which we get regularly told about in the meetings we have here. And of course, then there's even low carbon cement, trying to bring about how to make low carbon cement, because as you know, that's one of the industrial sectors that is so difficult for us to bring about a much cleaner future. Well, MIT is really, for me, exhibit A of one of the key things I mean to say today, which might fit into this pompous title, but it is that the civil society in this country is absolutely vital to the contribution of transforming not just our energy sector, but the rest of society, and to get us to a low carbon future. And I think that's not widely recognized in many circles, and it also makes me more positive about what's going to happen. But obviously, if we step back, I think most everybody is dealing with, to some degree, the absolute profound churning events that we are amidst now, because most of them are unexpected and therefore not prepared for, and they have had a profound shaking of our thinking. And obviously we're talking about the global pandemic, the Putin's war, the first ever challenge in America to the peaceful transfer of power, even the Supreme Court decision that divides America with people on both sides that are absolutely committed and intense about it. Speaking of the Dobbs decision, not to mention inflation and turmoil in our energy markets. And the conventional wisdom has not held up in almost all of these areas. And therefore, it makes it much more difficult for us to think we know how to predict an uncertain future anyway, and also question our own ability as a nation or anywhere to actually take on these challenges. And obviously climate change is one of the most important. Just today, of course, out of the United Nations Climate Office came a report that tried to add up what all the countries under the Paris Agreement have so far committed to do, and of course indicates it's very short. And whatever you think about the uncertainty of the numbers, it is nonetheless raising the urgency question here. Well, if we turn back into our own country here, it may not be your country, everybody's here, I realize, but in America, we've actually seen absolutely stunning, and by the way, in many cases, again, unpredicted and unexpected behavior by the United States Congress, of all places, would you believe. They've really, in the last 2 years, came out with 5 very significant pieces of legislation that became law under President Biden, one of them under President Trump. And I'm just going to tick them off quickly, but the 2020 Energy Act, part of a massive appropriations bill at the end of the Trump administration, is pushing all kinds of research and development. The infrastructure bill, we hear about constantly about how to try to revive that and the elements that are related to climate. The CHIPS and Science bill is a massive, we were told, you folks would know better, and I'm sure participated in helping to give the ideas for what it should be. CHIPS and Science Act were a huge injection into the research and development in this country. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is commonly known as the Reconciliation Bill, had a massive number of proposals dealing with climate. And one of the most surprising, in fact, I'd almost like to take a poll, but I'm not going to do it here, to say, were you aware that the United States Senate, which is divided almost, well, it is equally, got a vice president that settles things, it passed by 2/3 a new treaty that relates to climate. It adopted the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which had been negotiated under the Reagan administration years ago. This is to try to limit HFCs, and it actually has regulatory impact. And yet 2/3 of the Senate managed to do it, it seems like in the dark of night for most Americans. Well, you can get, and people can get, and I'm not going to attempt to do it here, summaries of all of these things and various quick turnaround analyses that have been done. But I just want to say a few things about the general character of this dramatic increase in federal action, and some of it will probably be quite obvious. And the first, obviously, is that it is a big deal. It is very significant actions that are being taken, more than what we would expect or I would expect out of the Congress at any one time. But also, as has been much commented on, it's essentially a set of carrots in the IRA as opposed to sticks, meaning that it's a lot of financial incentives designed to try to entice the behavior of consumers, entice the behavior of businesses and innovators and investors into more clean tech knowledge primarily. And that's as opposed to where you try to put on penalties or by tax penalties or which can be carbon tax, cap and trade on fossil fuels, or you also regulate with mandates to reshape the marketplace. Now, of course, this is on top of some major existing law in this country that actually already has in place a whole series of regulatory systems like automobile efficiency and appliance efficiency kind of thing. And one of the more interesting twists in this bill was the fact that they actually gave new authority, or at least they clarified the authority so they'd keep the Supreme Court away from the EPA on at least the issue of regulating greenhouse gases by saying that they do have the authority under the Clean Air Act in EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. Now we'll have to see where that actually comes out. There will be always challenges to the way in which those regulations are written, but this at least cements into the law what was known as Massachusetts versus EPA, when a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court said that EPA could regulate greenhouse gases. Now, the carrots involved, and I've tried to read through some of the summaries, but they claim it's about 100 programs of tax credits, grants, loans, loan guarantees. About 80% of the total package are tax credits or tax incentives. And a crude estimate is that in the next decade, over the decade, they will cost the federal government about or the government will be laying out about $370 billion, and that somehow that will support some $3 trillion of investment by the private sector. Now, you have to remember that the private sector may be investing a lot of that anyway. You just don't know under tax credits when they're always. But this leads to the difficult question of just how effective all of this will be, because essentially when you try not to use carbon taxing, or you try not to use too many mandates, what you end up doing is saying all these tax credits, their effectiveness depends on other market factors. It depends on whether you as a consumer really are willing to go out and get an EV. It depends on whether somebody's willing to invest in the kinds of things where they can capitalize on that. But politically, the impact of this is very significant given the difficulties we've had so far. And that is that it is so much easier in politics to give away taxes than it is to penalize or put requirements onto people. And by the way, since one of the challenges is the question of we may have turnover in Congress, we may have turnover in the White House, we may turn over in the grave. I mean, who knows? But the fact is that that these tax credits are more likely to be politically sustained than other forms of government intervention. That at least has been the history in the past kind of thing. I'm not counting on that, but I just think that can be important. Now, another element of this is, while we've had many debates in this country over should the federal government engage in what we call industrial policy, where it makes choices over what technology the marketplace will push, or over which businesses will be supported, and you try to keep them here. And in fact, this was a significant intervention in that regard, in which we actually had, instead of, as many of the reports, maybe Bobby may correct me, is the future of coal, future of this, future of that, usually said that here are the technology choices that and you ought to support them in R&D, but then the marketplace ought to make the choice which one will be. Well, now we're pretty much trying to make a market choice. It's going to be electric vehicles. There are different kinds, but it's going to be that. It's not going to wait and see if other alternatives come up. And also, of course, we've actually decided that we're going to try to support the building of a domestic industry, whether it's in certain kinds of mining, like lithium mining, or whether it's in the chips, obviously, kind of thing. It does represent, in part, a shifting away in public policy from the globalism that tended to dominate a lot of the argument and some of the policies over the last 20 years, because this is obviously more nationalistic for various reasons than some other things, but that it also has a tendency to make it more popular. Now let me turn just in the broadest sense to kind of remind myself and others that most of this addressing by state, federal policy in America is really highly dependent on technology being able to provide us a future in which we can still have the kind of lifestyles and the kind of economic growth that we want or we have expected or come to expect in this country. And it's very important to recognize there is a whole nother advocacy that is saying, wait a minute, this is never going to add up. We have to give up some of our material wants and how big our houses are and lots of other things if we want to be realistic about this. Now, that kind of advocacy, while it's very appealing to many people, seems to have more resonance in the pulpit than it does in the political arena. But I do think it's very important that we recognize there is a difference here. One of the things often commented on, which I think anybody who's looked at these policies understands, is there's a great effort here to try to bring social equity questions into the climate and energy area. Now, they've always been there to some degree. That's always been an argument over some equity, but nothing comparable to the effort to try to make sure that you are recognizing there are underserved places in the country, that you are recognizing that there are places that got taken advantage of by pollution, even exploited, some would say, and so there is a real effort. Now, this is part of a broader goal the administration has set for its agency heads to try to do what is called Justice 40, that 40% of the grants and things, if you have discretion in all walks of life in the federal government, that you will try to focus those on some of these equity issues kind of thing. Here, of course, part of the way it was done was, I think, a somewhat new twist. John may know differently as how much this has been used before, but taking a tax credit that is going to be there to put in a plant or something and giving it a 10% or 20% boost, that if you will follow some social policy guidelines, whether they're labor guidelines or whether they're location in an area that either is going to be hurt by the transition, meaning where there are coal miners or coal production kind of thing, that is an effort to try to get the private investment to focus on some of these social goals. Now, to be honest with you, this is brand new, or at least it's significantly new, and it's whether it works and what's effective is going to be a serious question going forward. And for those scholars that are interested in, this is a good place to focus on public policy and public action as to what works, what doesn't, whether it's accomplishing its goals or not. And of course, for activist organizations, they're going to be the ones that have already stepped forward, are going to want to focus heavily on whether the administration programs, the state governments, the industries and whatnot are living up to these kind of propositions. Well, let me describe just a few more what you might call spillover effects. They're not direct response to the tax credit as an investment, but they are having a broader societal, in my view, effect. And one is, this enables state governments in their policies to be more aggressive, whether it's in their mandates or if they have a pricing that a couple of them do policy or whatnot. Why? Because it makes it cheaper for some of the investments that they will try to force within their state. And by the way, a long time ago, we had the federal government subsidizing the state of Iowa farmers who were putting in windmills, kind of thing. And anyway, the point is, federal carrots, state sticks is going to be partially what we already have, but it's going to be even more intense here. Now, and we already see states taking on new ambition independent before this was ever passed. California, of course, here in Massachusetts, and others. And I think it's very important to also recognize, since we seem to be obsessed with the blue, red division in politics, as if everybody is on one side and everybody one on the other, and all the states are either red or blue, and it doesn't take any commentator 2 minutes to arrive at major conclusions about that. But many red states do have various policies for solar, for wind, for RPSs, we would call them, that actually go forward. And I'm told that under the Infrastructure Act, where you apply as a state for some money to put in charging stations in your state along your highways, every state has put in an application. And that a whole bunch of them have already gotten it, meaning that they didn't take the political view, oh, we can't do that. No, they'll take the money. So we see this, and of course, the fact is that, and this issue of red-blue division, which I think is overstated in our society, but the truth is, businesses everywhere, wherever they're operating, have eligibility for these tax credits, and whether they're making investments or whatever they're doing. So there's no limitation there. Now let's be clear, at the federal level, at the state level, there's going to be a lot of fight along a lot of these issues politically. And already we see some red states, in this case, actually saying that the funds that they collect, that they have for their employees, their pension funds, they're not going to invest them in any big corporation who ends up pushing other people to take action on climate. They're trying to see if they can bring that to twist. We're going to see whether that gets very far or how many ever do it. But it just goes to show you that there's going to be a turmoil and an undertow. Let me take another spillover effect, which is pretty obvious, I think, and that is this does enhance U.S. credibility in international negotiations, whether they're UN multilateral negotiations or whether they're bilateral. And I think people are beginning to agree that more likely to be successful with bilateral or smaller group negotiations than with the massive UN negotiation. Not to say you don't go forward with that, but that for effectiveness kind of thing. And of course, one of the big arguments for so much of this in the Congress was that it makes us, our economy in America, more competitive in the international markets on issues of clean tech, and especially vis-a-vis China, which has become a motivator in American politics. Like it or not, some of it gets out of hand in my view, the language, but nonetheless, there is no question that it is causing and bringing together across blue, red, all things, and efforts here for us to be more competitive. And it's also, probably this audience would not be surprised, but a lot of American audiences are always surprised at how much influence foreign government policies, in climate in this case, and markets have on industry development here in America. They tend to view it as otherwise. We produce things, we produce the technology, and we take it abroad, and aren't we wonderful? And the issue here is that if we look at this radical decline in solar costs over, and I better be careful here, there's this, and I chaired the External Advisory Committee on the future of solar, which John was very much involved in. But the fact was that the government of Germany, the government of Spain, put a huge incentive into the marketplace, and even with lots of cloudy days in Germany, they built a huge industry up. And of course, China just engaged in industrial policy to produce all kinds of things. Well, all of that led to, along with the research that's been done here at MIT and America, a real sharp decline in the cost of solar energy. So that's effective. Another is, while we're trying to incentivize and get American companies and others to go with electric vehicles, the fact is other governments are doing that, and the market is growing abroad, and GM and Ford, if they wanted to be as they are and produce cars, we're going to have to go there anyway. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't do it, but my point is these things are, in some cases, really redounding to our benefit. Well, let me just mention quickly, and I'm trying not to take too much more time here and open it up to your comments or questions and whatnot, is that just some of the big disputes that are out there ahead of us as we talk. They're both intellectually argued, but also they're going to be politically heavy kind of thing. And of course, the biggest, but I'm not going to try to get into it here, is, so what's the next generation of policy to try to further accelerate things? But I can assure you the Congress is not going to do it in the lame duck session, so no need to get too worked up on it at the moment. But the first is that the first big dispute is, how can we accelerate the deployment of the new clean technology and the clean industry things? Obviously, you've got to have solar farms, you've got to have windmills offshore, you've got to have transmission lines that cross interstate boundaries, and you've got to, you're going to even probably do some mining. Heard the Secretary of Energy recently talk about clean mining, which you never would have heard a Democrat 20 years ago speaking that kind of language. And now there's an argument over a carbon dioxide pipeline that is supposed to help advance carbon capture. Obviously, we have permitting systems at the federal level, at the state level, sometimes at the local level, and these can have very important consequences for protecting people and society, but they can also obviously really impede projects and kill projects and delay. And we need to go forward fast if you believe the United Nations and other kinds of reports. And environmental groups in this country who historically spent most of their time trying to raise questions and doubts about specific projects, sometimes stop them, sometimes get them approved or moved, kind of thing, increasingly are trying to figure out how to get to the other side of the equation and be for something and not just against it, because we need action as well as bringing a balance into this kind of thing. And there is a lot of academic, a lot of stakeholder discussions, a lot of industry and political that are focused on trying to figure out, is there a way to bring in a balance in this equation as we go forward with projects? And I might just say that obviously the rising of the new focus on, or at least the more intense focus on environmental justice is another element of, excuse me, we want to make sure we're not running over the same people that got run over the last time, kind of thing. So it's fair to raise and make sure they have a chance to participate. On the other hand, they also, in many of these communities, may have their greatest opportunity to get something that's pretty clean and brings jobs and economy and advancement to their communities. So this is is going to be a challenge to try to do this kind of thing. But the real challenge for this thing is, what about imperfect projects? Because there are likely to be a lot of them. Almost every project disturbs somebody to begin with. And so we just can't go with, well, if somebody's disturbed, we can't have it. And at the same time, lots of projects are going to go into this debate that goes on in this country, the next one I'm going to get to, which is, well, wait a minute. Why don't we leapfrog to this technology that is really the superior way to do it, much more costly perhaps, or we're not really ready for it. But and the project managers are arguing, wait a minute, this will get us up the ladder of transition. This is a hard one to resolve. It's always in politics, it's hard. It's like making the choice between, wait a minute, I believe in X, and they've compromised again in the Commerce Committee, and it gets us two-thirds of the way to X. Do I accept that, or do I insist we got to have X? And which is the ethical thing to do? Well, this is a challenge that's going to arise over and over. Let me just quickly mention two others, and then a couple other comments on civil society. Excuse me, I was trying to keep this short for you, but it's not turning out that way. And one is, and I'm not going to say much about this, the role of natural gas in our society is already an intense argument. Here in Massachusetts, the legislature's told 10 committees you can stop any new hookups, but it's between, is it a bridge to the future and critical, or is it something you've got to stop every molecule you can of methane because it's a climate action? And of course, federal policy at the moment is really focused on just trying to curb the fugitive emissions that come in this process because, of course, they're so potent as a greenhouse gas. And if you don't think it's going to be political, which I'm sure many of you do, the American Gas Association, which represents America's distributing companies, those are local distributing companies, just came out last week or so, announced how important this election is. They've got to beat the people that want to demonize gas, including the President of the United States. Of course, the other side of the equation is saying, what do you mean the president's demonizing gas? He's supporting it. Anyway, it's an issue that is going to drive us, some of us to distraction. And the third one is one that folks here are very much involved in, of course, and that is the question of technological priorities going forward. There's certainly been a strong advocacy of, wait a minute, we know how to utilize the sun and the wind, let's just go whole hog after that, and maybe we need storage to help make that work or something, but we don't need to invest in those bigger long-term propositions kind of thing. And of course, then there's, in my view, there are any number of major reports and analysis that suggest we don't really know whether we could get to 2050 net zero without some major new technological additions to the pool kind of thing. And my own view is there's so many uncertainties about everything, just as my opening statement about the credit that we made, that we need to make sure we're doing multiple things and betting on multiple things so that we, in other words, a portfolio kind of effect. But that's easier said than done. But the current policy and the policy embedded in this legislation, starting with that 2020 Act, is all about doing both. It's all about advancing the technologies we know into the marketplace and at the same time driving for breakthroughs in some of the bigger technologies. Well, let me just say a couple more things about what I mentioned at the beginning about this theme of civil society, and just to indicate that and its role and importance in this country particularly, because it's some would argue it's more highly developed and has so many more ramifications in America than elsewhere. And of course, the Chinese have been through a big argument within the Communist Party in which they have declared that developing civil society, allowing it to flourish, is a big mistake because it leads to instability. And it led to the overthrow in the eastern, the former Soviet republics of power. You just don't want to take any chances here, and they're oversimplifying. But basically, if you think about it, at least I've been trying to, there's sort of three big buckets of activities in our society. One bucket is the government activities and the efforts to try to get the government to stop or to do something. And that's, of course, we have a very governmental structure that is highly dispersed authority, whether it's through federalism or whether it's through separation of powers or a whole bunch of other techniques. So it is, compared to some places, quite decentralized. The second is, the bucket is, of course, is this vast economy of commercial relationships and things based on money and whatnot, and the production and consumption, obviously. But the third area is the civil society, which I've already mentioned. Of course, obviously, MIT is a part of in our universities, but there's just a plethora of organizations for whole different purposes, whether it's for religious, educational, charitable, entertainment, sports, you name it. And there's an association, it probably is right here at MIT, a student association or something of that. And the key thing is, that distinguishes this from the way the Chinese at the moment are handling it, is there's very little effort for the government to control those. There are some people in government who like to control those activities, but they can act highly independent, and therefore they can drive for things that others are not willing to do and whatnot. Now, this does not always work to good purposes. Partly, this diversity and this decentralization in civil society partly led to the skill of deniers and others being able to stop some climate action. But now my view is this is starting to all move in the right direction in a very dynamic and a very important way. Whether it's generating knowledge and spreading it, whether it's reducing carbon footprints for your church or for whatever organization you're in, or whether it's trying to drive the political side of things and push the government to take action or push the corporation to take action. And we see examples all over the place of this. I won't go through and mention some of the organizations. I just do want to say one more thing. What we have seen over the last few years, too, is a big uptick in philanthropy related to climate. And that supports a lot of these organizations that are taking actions. But the Climate Works Foundation, which tries to track this, they have a new report out called something or other, called, I think it's New Momentum, it's called. But all it tracks is high-worth individuals and big foundations that spend money. But they are doing it significantly, an increase. And of course, Jeff Bezos stole the publicity for a while in 2020 when he said, I'll put up $10 billion for the next 10 years to do this. And then, fortunately, his wife, whom he had recently divorced, she's almost doing him one better. It probably is going to be better. She's putting a lot of minute in. But that's not what's important here. What's really important is that this is spreading among us. I suspect many in this room make contributions, however small or large, to this kind of effort. And it clearly is growing. Let me just conclude by suggesting that I think to kind of understand what's happening, it's very important to try to look across all these three areas of activity. Barely touched on the economic one, except the politics, and I don't pretend to have given a full picture. What it does for me is it helps me get a more a view of this incredible dynamism that is happening, which, by the way, also gives me a more positive outlook about how we're doing in America. Well, in 1969, when I was a graduate student working on a pathetic dissertation at Georgetown, the United States sent a man to the moon. And as we all know, it was an extraordinary scientific, technical, and organizational achievement. But I had nothing to do with it, nor did the vast majority of Americans. We could only watch in awe. Not so with climate change. The fact is, first of all, we're all contributors to some degree. I realize some individuals and some corporations are outlandish in this regard, but we also all can do something. And again, you can go to the internet and you can find any number of ways just in your own consumption to help contribute to a better world here on climate change. Or you can join any number of groups, some political, some not political, in the civil society to try to take action. So in my view, this is clearly not a time for hand-wringing. This is a time for action. People have to roll up their sleeves and go to work and not roll them down anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Phil. That was really great. You're an optimist.
Well, trying to be. I go to a coffee shop where every morning it's, oh my God, we're going downhill, the whole country, everything's going on. I can't stand it.
So I was going to ask you about the negative role of social media
Well,
in
sure.
disrupting our plans.
Right.
But you, towards the end, you sounded quite positive about sort of positive, net positive progress.
I think net
Now
positive is the way I would put it.
Okay.
Also, if you look at it, obviously, if you think we should be regulating social media, we're struggling over what's an effective way, and also how far do we want to go, given the First Amendment, to do that. But I think we've moved out of the era of the absolute Wild West that we've been through for several years politically and socially, where anybody can say anything and get away with it. And so we see just different ways in which this is coming to bear. Kanye West just gets an example of, now that wasn't, but social media was giving incredible voice to what he had to say, but also the companies themselves under great pressure, the platforms are clearly doing that. We're now a lot more alert to the dangers of it, or the fact that it's going to be this. So I see that as a plus. I don't think we're out of the thing with it. But that too, social media is one of the biggest changes in politics, is the speed and the way in which things can be. Anyway.
Yeah. So we have mics in either aisle, and so if you have a question, feel free to. You could raise your hand if you don't want to go to a mic, and we'll try to get a mic to you. I have another question about the
title.
Well, no. So you started off.
I tried to get close.
So you start off with this interesting story about the 5 major pieces of legislation passed since 2020. So what do you learn? What are your takeaways from the success there? Some of those were bipartisan.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what do you learn about that in a period where I think most of us look from a distance and say, Congress can't get anything done. Right?
Well, that's the general conventional wisdom. Congress is constipated. It can't make a decision on anything important. And yet, and I'm usually a pusher of Congress, not a defender. And yet what we've witnessed is it put out incredible, whether it did it well or not, sums of money under the previous administration and then under this administration to deal with the COVID crisis. Then the United States government came together red and blue to support the Ukrainians against Russia. Sadly to say, it seems to take a Russian invasion or Chinese probing us economically to get us moving, but we are moving and these things are happening. And it's too easy to get caught up in the old view that, well, they can't do anything. By the way, Congress was never liked, not since the Second Continental Congress. George Washington used to have fits over their inability to get a decision on funding, but it's not to be loved.
So you also mentioned some of the challenges in getting infrastructure built, doing things we need, given NIMBYism.
NIMBY.
So we need more solar, but just not in any property near me. We need transmission, but not through my city or through my town.
Well, transmission, deciding is not as much difficult as deciding who's going to pay for it. When you're allocating the cost, that allocation issue is a big issue. Excuse me.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have a question. The CEO of JP Morgan said during New York Climate Week that stopping fossil fuel investments would be the road to hell for America. So what's your
I'm
take?
sorry, I didn't hear you. You said what?
He said stopping fossil fuel investments into exploiting fossil fuel projects would be the road to hell for America. So according to him, we need a lot more investments into fossil fuels. What's your take on that? How much do we need? How much can we take? How can we go forward there?
I have to admit, investors and others don't want to ask me questions about the marketplace and which we should do, and I honestly don't. I just haven't looked at that equation. I'm of a mode now in my elder years of just push to try to get more in the clean sector. And because the fossil fuel sector, politically and economically, it's the incumbent. But now that what's turning in this world is the incumbent is becoming cleaner technologies. And I'm talking about everything from efficiency to fusion, by the way. I believe in nuclear power. But so I don't, and by the way, the government never makes that kind of balance. It's what it comes out of the bankings and the investors' decisions. But those new things are designed to try to skew that whole thing toward the cleaner side. So I'm not very helpful to you, I'm afraid.
No, but thanks for the answer. I mean, I have a small follow-up. In the title, you say about crisis and disruption of our plans. So we saw that in the past, right? But
right.
What might happen in the future, right, is we had some droughts here in the States this year. Things might get a lot worse. How do you think those things will affect policy and
well, you know, the war in Ukraine obviously upset the energy markets and found ourselves our administration trying to help get more gas into their system. And Germany was, you know, had, in my view, foolishly shut down a number of nuclear plants, and it was now having to shift to coal into these things. Hopefully all of that is temporary. Hopefully somebody's going to take out, some of the Russians will take out their leader one way or another, and I'm not suggesting how to do that. But the point is that I'm hoping that's a temporary thing. One of the good things it did was in Europe, as I gather, and at least many voices are there saying, it shows us why we've got to get to solar and wind and other things rather than dependent on fossil fuels. That same argument's being made in the United States, but obviously it's up against a heavy thing.
Thank you.
The question on the other side?
Yeah, so I'm probably the least educated person here, so bear with me. But as far as my understanding...
I was afraid I was going to be, but go ahead.
So as far as my understanding of the whole energy thing goes, I think we should ditch all the coal, replace it with natural gas, and then we should phase out the natural gas in favor of nuclear. And the reason that I think that is because I look at these renewables, and again, apologies to anybody in the crowd, but we've been subsidizing for a very long time. Some investors have made the case that they're not super profitable without the subsidies. Germany's obviously got energy prices through the roof right now. You talked about how the prices have been going down. Some of that might be due to certain countries having industrial policies that allow them to manipulate the market in ways that might mess with Western organizations. And I think also a period of cheap energy that we've gone through has also led to renewables coming in at such low cost. And also they're very low cost at low system penetrations, but with current battery technology at higher system penetrations, they're very high cost. So my question is, from a government perspective, it seems like the government is gung-ho, pro-solar, pro-wind. And you mentioned that there's plenty of innovations, in particular here at this school, with folks putting photovoltaics on windows and everything. But does the government consider that maybe these supply chain issues, these natural resource issues, these intermittency issues, which are yet unsolved, does the government consider that those might be issues that might need us to readdress our valuations of that technology?
Well, of course, when you speak of the government, you have to ask yourself, what entity are you talking about? And as one wag said about the executive branch of the U.S. government alone, not to mention the whole government, it's a splintered thing because there are different things that are happening. But without being cute here, let me say, first of all, I think when you say we should try to substitute natural gas for coal. Of course, we've actually, the marketplace has been doing that, very important. The only difference I would have with you is that I think you're underestimating the value and in the market value of the wind, solar, and them. But the government is not just, the government had, I said there were 110 things. Well, that was for carbon capture and storage. That was for carbon dioxide pipelines. It was for lots of different things that dealt with a number of the issues that you have raised. Now, that's not to mean it was all rational and put together in a way, because it's always political forces pushing everything. But there's no way our government is going to suddenly take out natural gas. It's going to use it, and you've articulated the argument on the one side, it has to be a bridge to the future. It also does all kinds of other functions in our economy on the chemicals and whatnot, and even hydrogen, which we're thinking is another frontier fuel for us.
Okay, cool. So we're thinking about these things and
Yeah,
trying to
well, let me put it this way. There's always somebody at my MIT, there's somebody in the Department of Energy, there's somebody in the Congress, there's trade associations that are always thinking about some of these things. What does not happen, which I know people sometimes intellectually would like, is that somehow we could sit down and we could intellectually agree on what our choices will be, and we could impose them in the economy. I think we actually, and part of what I was getting at, did not say as forcefully, is the structure of our economy that is very diverse and dynamic and marketplace, the structure of our politics, which does not allow the concentration of authority, which after the last president, surely many people don't think they want to go too far. And obviously I'm being very political now. But also, and the structure of our very dynamic civil society we're talking about, this is a better way to go than trying to think that Beijing can mastermind this. I may be wrong. Beijing is going to make lots of great contributions to change in this earth that's positive for us too. But I'm willing to bet more that we're going to have more innovation and more dynamic change as we begin to get this going, which we are.
Okay. I wasn't trying to score points against wind and solar or anything like that.
Pardon?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
To this side? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering if in the US too there is a tendency to renationalize, let's say, energy companies like utilities. So in Europe, for example, EDF has been more nationalized, and in Germany too, some energy companies have been nationalized because otherwise they would go bankrupt in the current crisis. So I'm wondering if that also happens in the US, and if it does, would that mean that some branches of the government can now have more of a say of how these utilities should develop?
Well, actually, when John Dingell was in the executive, that was the chairman of my committee, John Deutsch, back in the 1970s was involved in these issues. We had extensive hearings in Congress, and everybody was saying, is there a way to have the government actually do some of these functions that we have the private sector doing now? And overwhelmingly we came away with no, and in fact over time we reduced the government activities. And I just think that is a part of a general philosophy. Now, it may not hold up, but I think there's a general feeling that it's not likely to be as efficient, and we're more likely to make bad choices. Now, that does not mean we are not, and this legislation does, aggressively going into the marketplace, much more aggressively than recently. We did it very aggressively in the 70s, and trying to push various alternatives, which we're doing. But nationalizing is not one of them. The only, actually close to that, when Bernie Sanders was running for president, he put out it's a general platform. Most of them put out something. Some of it belongs. Anyway, he put out a thing, and he suggested that the way to keep the cost down for the consumer was for the federal government, on the last gentleman's question, to actually build the solar and the facilities and stuff like that. He dropped that in his articulation. It never got anywhere. But that's as close as in recent time we've come.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for this interesting conversation. I appreciated very much your summary of federal bills or federal laws that were recently adopted and that contain a lot of climate policies, because one can easily lose track of what's going on. And I agree that it does give the U.S. government more legitimacy on in the international arena. A less optimistic way of looking at this is that the U.S. is a decade behind other countries, and that it has had to wait so long to enact policies that would allow it to go forward with the energy transition. And so, but a benefit of that, it occurred to me, is that we can also look at other countries and see what's worked for them over the last decade and see what hasn't worked for them over the last decade. Sort of like looking at a menu and picking and choosing what is best. And I wonder if you have views or ideas as to what foreign energy policies that have been adopted in other democracies or other countries the U.S. could adopt. What's worked in other countries in your view, and what could work in the U.S. if we were to replicate this?
Well, I know a few I might mention, and I'm not even sure I can remember them at this point, but that is often looked at. Just to go back, we Americans do need to recognize that we've had our long run on the freedom to put in the atmosphere a lot of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, and we're right at the top of the list of the past. We're not at the moment, but we're big. So we have some, in my view, special obligation, and there's no question that we were slow in getting at it, and we had a real effort to backlash when President Trump came in. Although the interesting thing about that was, when he dropped the Paris Agreement, which they never told the truth about it. It wasn't a treaty. It didn't require us to do anything except put on the table what we might do. But the point was, it was interesting how many industries, including American oil and gas industry, says, don't do that, we've got to do more. And now you see in American society, virtually every major corporation, just like MIT and the state governments and everything else, think they've got to have a net zero target. Now, we know everybody's not going to get there, but the point is this is really changing. So the comparative, but a lot of effort went in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and elsewhere to figure out the different techniques that people have used in different places. The very fact that we are actually investing now in chip manufacture, that's really adopting an approach used elsewhere in the world kind of thing. So that's not a very good answer, but it's...
That's good. Thank you very much.
Yes?
In your presentation, thank you for the presentation firstly, and in your presentation you mentioned one aspect about degrowth. Did I understand that correctly? Or because you said that the amount we're consuming right now, there's a possibility that we need to reduce it as well. Is that a serious consideration in the U.S. government, or how is degrowth looked upon at the moment?
I'm not sure I understood what you were asking.
Degrowth, or more of less consumption?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there is a big drive, and it's in this, and it's been there since the 1970s in federal policy, to try to get us more, to use less gasoline and stuff, to use it by virtue of not really driving less, but by virtue of getting more efficiency. That's very important. That's what we can do all across the board. MIT scholars have contributed to any number of specifics in that regard, kind of thing. So I didn't mean that. It's really a lifestyle change that says, you know what, you should read books. You should engage in intellectual discussion. You should engage in the arts. Why do you have to build such a damn big house? Because you got the money. And it says, it says, let's do that. Why do you travel excessively when you might not need to? You get what I'm saying? It's a change that I'm not, I don't think this is going to politically sell. But the argument was being made initially in America that, well, if you clamp down on carbon fossil fuels, you will in fact change our lifestyle. We will not have economic growth. We will not be able to have the things we're used to, kind of thing. And that argument had an awful lot of appeal to too many people. That's partly why this legislation is carrots that are designed to say, wait a minute, we can have jobs, we can have justice, we can have clean energy. Now, that's a lot of rhetoric, I realize, but it is reflected in the legislation.
And if you don't mind, I've got one more question, but that's not.
I'm here. You guys, the audience may want to leave.
In light of the recent, the forthcoming midterm election and the future elections, say that it goes back to being the Republican Party comes in. And basically, I know that in Italy there's a case where the government changes every 3 years, so long-term robust policies are difficult to make. Is there a threat for that to be happen in the US as well, or how would you deal with it?
Well, let me very quickly say, obviously these elections this fall are very important. I have a very strong view of what should happen, and many people do, not because I think there are saints running on the Democratic ticket, by the way, but the issue. But several things to remember, at least for the next 2 years, because legislation and authorities are in place, and because legislation to pass must have the president's signature, he'll be able to hold a lot of things as they are, assuming that the Republicans won both houses and really got organized. They would also have to do what they claim they don't want to do, get rid of the filibuster, to be able to have that, unless they got 70 senators, which nobody thinks they're going to have, kind of their 60, whatever it is. And you get what I'm saying? So that is stabilized. But partly what I think has happened too is, first of all, a lot of people are underestimating the churn that is going on among Republicans. I meant to mention one conservative foundation that's very active in Washington, and in my view, some super people there. It's called ClearPath Foundation. Jay Faison, a billionaire from North Carolina, set it up, and Rich Powell's the executive director, and they engage in conversations with people of all stripes. But they engage almost daily with any member of the House or Senate on the Republican side who is willing to do this. And there are lots willing to support things. Many of those tax credits that passed under reconciliation, which is solely Democratic bill, they in fact probably will survive. There are Republicans that are committed to it. I'll just go back to one thing. The Trump administration, in their budget proposals, they tried to get rid of ARPA-E, which some of you here surely have engaged with. And ARPA-E was one of the most innovative efforts of us to try to support innovation. One of the reasons they did not make it, and in that year that the Trump budget said take it down, it went up. And yet they had a majority in the Senate and whatnot. Why did it go up? In part due to Ernie Moniz. When Ernie was in the previous administration, he and his team just spent all kinds of time on Capitol Hill. Probably has to do with the lobbying of some of the people here too. But they spent all their time trying to explain to them, this is not just some left-wing climate thing. It's got a very important other aspects to it. And so they were committed to it, these Republicans on the Appropriations Committee. Now, the other reason it survived, because it was in this massive end-of-the-year appropriations bill, when you get what you want, I get whatever I want, you get, we all get something. and actually, Americans, by and large, and commentators just hate that process. But it generated the 2020 Energy Act.
So one last question. Okay.
So the CHIPS and Science Act that was recently passed. Mm-hmm. So how can we track that for success and failure, and the role of NIST and the regulatory bodies, and the fact that they have to stand up like an advanced manufacturing institute? Like, does NIST have the infrastructure, and then the role of the Department of Commerce?
Well, I'm not the best person to ask, but there's no question. First of all, you can actually track a lot online these days that you never could in the past. But what I assume, I know you have people that the university has people that work for the university in Washington that try to track some of these things. There are all kinds of organizations that will, and I'm not familiar with them. But you also can create one too. If you have a particular part of that you want, and by the way, just hound any bastard you get hands on in Washington until they give you an answer. Excuse me.
Quick follow-up, can we think of it as a pace car or track the success and failure, and is it going to be modular to other initiatives?
Oh,
like
I'm sorry.
No, that's the follow-up.
Well, that is a planning that goes beyond me. I was in the Congress. We were not, planning was not, it was not even a word on the horizon. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Phil.